I had been riding the late-night trains for years. The city, with its endless lights and noise, was exhausting, and the quiet rumble of the subway was one of the few things that calmed my mind. The late hours were peaceful. There were no crowds, no rush, just me and the steel tracks under the train. That night felt different, though. I don't know how to explain it, but I could feel something off in the air. It wasn't something you could see, more like a tension I couldn't shake. Maybe it was because I had stayed out later than usual, or maybe because of the rumors I had heard. There had been stories floating around for months. Missing people. They were last seen on the subway late at night. I didn't think much of it like most people. The city's huge, and weird things happen all the time. But as I sat in the near-empty car, those stories kept creeping into my mind. The train screeched to a stop at a station, and a man got on. He wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his face, and he had a strange air about him. He didn't sit. Instead, he stood by the door, gripping the metal pole with one gloved hand. His head was tilted downward, but I could feel his eyes on me. I tried to ignore him. I looked out the window into the black tunnels, pretending like I didn't notice the tension in the car. But every so often, I'd sneak a glance his way. He hadn't moved an inch, still standing rigid, staring. My heart started to race, and I cursed myself for getting paranoid over nothing. Another stop came. The train doors opened. No one got on. The man remained at his spot by the door. The car seemed colder now, the kind of cold that creeps into your bones. The train lurched forward again, and I glanced at my phone, trying to distract myself. But there was no signal down here, not this deep underground. It was just me and him now. No one else in sight. My eyes flicked to the reflection in the window, and that's when I saw it. The man had shifted slightly, his head turning ever so slowly in my direction. He was definitely watching me now. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I decided to move. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood acting casual, like I was just changing seats, but in reality, I was making my way toward the door. The next station was just a few minutes away, and I figured I'd get off there, maybe take a cab home. But as I approached the door, I felt his eyes on me, sharper now, like they were boring into my back. I didn't dare look. My hands gripped the cold metal handle of the train door, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Was I just imagining this? Was he really following me? The train slowed, pulling into the next station. I could see the empty platform ahead. My heart pounded louder than the screeching of the brakes. I took a step closer to the door, my muscles tensing, ready to bolt the moment they opened. The train came to a full stop. The door hissed open, and without looking back, I darted out onto the platform. My footsteps echoed in the emptiness. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my breath coming in short bursts. I didn't even bother waiting for the train to leave. I just ran for the stairs. As I reached the top of the stairs, I glanced back down, hoping to see the train pulling away. But it wasn't. It sat still on the tracks, and the man, he was still standing in the doorway, staring straight up at me. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but I could see his eyes clearly now. They were empty, devoid of emotion, as if he was studying me, calculating. And then he stepped out of the train, slowly, calmly, as if he had all the time in the world. My heart stopped. For a split second, I was frozen in place, my mind screaming at me to move, but my body locked in fear. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I turned and sprinted out of the station, my feet pounding the pavement as I burst out into the cold night air. The streets were eerily quiet, the distant hum of the city almost non-existent at this hour. I didn't stop running until I reached the corner and hailed a cab. As I collapsed into the back seat, I looked out the window back toward the subway entrance. The man wasn't there. No one was. But the memory of his eyes stayed with me long after I got home that night. And from that day on, I never took the last train home again. I glanced at my watch. Midnight. The last train was supposed to arrive any minute, but the station was empty. I shifted nervously on the bench, feeling the cold seep through my thin jacket. I shouldn't have stayed at work so late. I didn't like being alone this late, especially in the dimly lit train station where every sound seemed louder and more menacing. There was only one platform, and the silence was unsettling. The buzzing of a flickering light overhead made the hairs on my arms stand up. I kept checking my phone, but the battery had died hours ago. My only option was to wait. The wind picked up, howling through the station like it had somewhere important to be. I heard footsteps in the distance. They echoed loudly, bouncing off the cold concrete walls. My heart raced. I turned around, trying to pinpoint the source, but I saw nothing. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on my mind. I wasn't alone for long. A man appeared at the far end of the platform. He wore a long, dark coat, and his face was hidden beneath a hat. He walked with purpose, each step slow and deliberate, his shoes clacking against the ground. My chest tightened. He was headed in my direction. There was something off about him, though I couldn't put my finger on it. He didn't look like someone who missed the last train. His pace, too controlled. His hands were hidden in his pockets. I instinctively gripped the strap of my bag tighter and scooted to the far end of the bench. The man stopped just a few feet away from me. He stood still for what felt like an eternity, then slowly lowered himself onto the bench, leaving only a narrow gap between us. I pretended to look the other way, pretending to be calm, but every nerve in my body was on high alert. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him glance at me, and then he cleared his throat. Waiting for the last train, his voice was low, gravelly, the kind that sticks to your skin like the smell of smoke. "Yeah," I replied, my voice quieter than I'd intended. He nodded slowly, but didn't say anything more. He just sat there, staring at the empty tracks in front of us. The silence stretched on, oppressive and thick. I could hear my own heartbeat, thudding in my chest. I tried not to look at him, but I couldn't help it. Something about him made me uneasy. I shifted in my seat again, hoping he'd take the hint and move further away, but he stayed put. I could feel his presence too close, too heavy. I had the sudden, overwhelming urge to leave, to stand up and walk away. But where would I go? The station was isolated, and it was miles to the nearest open shop or streetlight. The wind howled again, and this time it carried a faint whistle, the train's whistle. Relief washed over me. I stood up, adjusting my bag and positioning myself near the edge of the platform. The man stayed seated, watching me with a strange look in his eyes. The train finally appeared, headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon. The brakes screeched as it slowed to a stop, and the doors slid open with a hiss. I stepped on, breathing a sigh of relief. I was almost home. The man followed. He sat across from me, close enough to keep an eye on me, but far enough that I didn't feel the need to move right away. The train lurched forward, heading out of the station and into the night. There were only a handful of passengers scattered throughout the car, most of them half asleep. The rhythmic clattering of the train on the tracks should have been soothing, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at my stomach. I stole another glance at the man. His eyes were fixed on me again, unblinking, intense. My breath hitched. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up and moved to a seat further down the car, hoping that would be enough to put some distance between us. The train rattled on, the city lights flickering by outside the window. I tried to relax, to remind myself that I was overreacting. Maybe he was just a lonely guy waiting for his train home, same as me. But then I saw him rise from his seat and walk toward me, his steps slow, deliberate, like before. My heart hammered against my ribs. Why was he following me? I stood up just as the train began to slow down. My stop. I hurried toward the doors, feeling his eyes on my back the whole time. The train came to a halt, and I practically jumped out onto the platform, my legs shaking. I turned around one last time to see him still standing on the train, staring at me as the doors slid shut. The train pulled away, and he disappeared into the night. I never saw him again, but even now, every time I take the last train home, I feel those eyes watching, waiting. It was late, too late for me to be out alone, but there I was, standing on the platform, waiting for the last train of the night. The platform was almost empty except for a couple of people, an older man in a brown coat and a young woman scrolling through her phone. The lights flickered above, and the air was cold. I shoved my hands deeper into my pockets, wondering why I didn't just call a cab. The train screeched into the station, its metal doors clanking open with a tired sigh. I stepped inside and found a seat near the back, away from the few other passengers. The carriage smelled of stale air and old seats. It had that vibe, that uncomfortable quiet, like you were somewhere you shouldn't be. But it was late, and I just wanted to get home. The train started moving, rocking gently from side to side as it sped through the tunnel. I glanced out the window. though there wasn't much to see, just darkness and the occasional blur of lights. I put my headphones in and leaned back, trying to relax. But something didn't feel right. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I shifted in my seat and scanned the carriage. The young woman was a few seats ahead, still glued to her phone. The older man had moved closer to the front of the train, now hidden from view by a partition. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. That's when I noticed him. He was sitting at the very end of the carriage, in the shadows. I hadn't seen him board the train. He wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his face, but his eyes were fixed on me. I looked away quickly, trying to pretend I hadn't noticed. My heart started to race. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was just another tired commuter, minding his own business. But when I dared to glance back, he hadn't moved, still staring. I shifted in my seat, trying to calm myself down. I told myself I was overreacting. But then the train stopped. Not at a station, just stopped. The lights flickered again, and the engine hummed softly. I took out my headphones, now on full alert. The young woman looked up from her phone, frowning, and the older man appeared from the front of the train, peering around as if expecting some kind of announcement. But there was nothing. We sat there for a few minutes, the train dead in the tracks, stuck in the middle of nowhere. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I turned my head and saw the man in the hoodie standing up, making his way down the aisle, toward me. His eyes never left mine. I panicked. My first instinct was to get up and move, but where would I go? I was trapped on this train, with nowhere to hide. My heart pounded in my chest as he got closer. I stood up, ready to move, to do something, anything, but I couldn't. He stopped a few feet from me, just standing there. His face was shadowed by the hoodie, but I could see his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The threat was clear. The train jolted suddenly, the lights flickering again. For a moment, I thought it was going to start moving, but it just lurched and stopped again. The man in the hoodie didn't flinch. He just stood there, waiting. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I needed to do something, but I couldn't think straight. I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling as I tried to unlock it, but before I could do anything, the man in the hoodie turned around and walked away, back to his seat at the end of the carriage. My body felt like it was made of stone. I stayed frozen in place, watching as he sat down again, never looking back at me. The train started moving, slowly at first, then picking up speed like nothing had happened. I collapsed back into my seat, my hands shaking. The older man and the young woman looked just as confused as I was, but neither of them seemed to have noticed what had just happened. I kept my eyes on the man in the hoodie, but he didn't move again. He just sat there, staring out the window. When we finally pulled into the next station, I didn't wait. I shot out of my seat and practically ran for the door. As I stepped onto the platform, I glanced back, expecting to see the man in the hoodie following me. But he wasn't there. He was still sitting in the same spot, staring into the dark tunnel as the train doors closed behind me. I never took the last train again.